right, let me begin again because I didn't record. All right. So welcome to Maryland Nonprofits Equity Webinar Series, What's the Matter with Justice? Today's session is sponsored by Care First. At the conclusion of this webinar, the slides and the recording will be made available to you. Next slide, please. All participants will be put on mute. We ask that you put your questions in the Q&A section and we'll answer them at the appropriate time. Maryland Nonprofits welcomes you. We are committed to strengthening organizations and networks for greater quality of life. We hope you're well during this COVID season. Please be mindful of our upcoming events coming up later this month and throughout the fall. You can visit us at marylandnonprofits.org to learn more about our events. If you are joining us for the first time, we've been holding these sessions since COVID struck and hope that you're well. Today's conversation will be joined by Keir Bradford Gray, the Chief Defender of the Defender Association of Philadelphia, and by Tara Huffman, the Director of Criminal and Juvenile Justice of the Open Society Institute in Baltimore. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you.
Thank you
for having me.
So we're looking forward to talking about what is a complex issue. Racial tension is not new to those of us who live in the US, but something seemed to happen that turned the earth upside down around May 25th when George Floyd was killed, and unfortunately several others after that. But how are you doing during this season? Has your world started to turn right side up somewhat?
Are you talking to us?
Yes, I am.
You know, this has unfortunately been my world long before George Floyd, so it's just kind of matched the timing to really get the narrative out and shape the discussion so that the solutions can be really pragmatic.
Thank you. What about you, Tara?
I would say the same, that this is the work that I do. This is my life's calling. What I would say is that it has accelerated at a clip that, is kind of hard to keep up with. Mm-hmm. There's a myriad of challenges, but also a myriad of opportunities, and just have this urgency to take advantage of as many of the opportunities as you can before the window closes. And so I'm appreciative of this conversation.
Thank you. So Tara, why don't you kick it off for us? And well, just tell us a little bit about what you do, and then I'll ask Keir to do the same thing, and then we'll come back to your presentation. So Tara, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do at OSI?
So I'm Director of the Criminal and Juvenile Justice Program at Open Society Institute in Baltimore. OSI Baltimore, as we refer to it, as part of a larger network of foundations, regional and national, that make up the Open Society Foundations Network globally. Specifically in Baltimore, we were funded and founded back in 1998 as a sort of experiment to see what would happen if a national global foundation made a sustained investment in one urban city in the United States. Could we begin to turn the tide, particularly in a city that had so many negative indicators? And so here we are, well over 20 years later, and we've been able to plant some seeds of justice and see those seeds come forth, but we still have a lot of work to do. And in my program in particular, I focus on reducing mass incarceration of Baltimore residents, with a particular focus on African Americans in Baltimore, because as you'll see in my presentation, Blacks in Baltimore and across the state of Maryland are arrested, prosecuted, convicted, incarcerated, and then continue to be punished long after their sentences are done at far higher rates than their counterparts of other races and ethnicities. And so we're going to talk about that, but that's the focus of my program. The focus of my program is to challenge that, to highlight it, get folks talking about it, and then work across as many sectors as possible to dismantle.
Thank you, Tara. That's very powerful, and we look forward to hearing more about that. And speaking of challenging, Kier Bradford Gray, will you tell us who you are? And many of us know you because of your defense of Michael White. What was it, a year ago, 2 years ago?
Oh, only a few months ago. It was in October.
Okay,
Seems
all
like a
right.
long time.
Okay, it does, right?
Yes.
So tell us who you are, Kier.
Yes, thank you so much, first of all, for having me for this very important discussion. My name is Kier Bradford Gray, and I am we call the Chief Defender of the Defender Association of Philadelphia. What that is, in essence, is the Executive Director of Philadelphia's Public Defender Organization and System. Philadelphia has one public defender organization that represents the entire city, and so we are it. We have over 536 staff that work here. And we obviously represent people who cannot afford lawyers in criminal court. We also do civil proceedings where we represent children who are abused and neglected. We also have a wing that represents juveniles who have been entangled in the system at the very early age of 10 and until they're 17. They are able to be in juvenile jurisdiction for certain offenses. So as you know, these are really tough roles. We've been fighting for these things for a very long time, and I'm glad it's becoming a household conversation so that more people can join us in our fight for justice and equality for all, but mostly Black and brown people.
Well, welcome to the discussion, ladies. Let's go to the next slide. And Tara, would you just get us going?
So
Before you do that, I'm going to go off camera so that they can focus on you and not look at me. And so, Tara, would you go off camera for while Kira's presenting as well?
mhm.
All right.
Go off.
Thank you again for this invitation. And as I was thinking about how to present information, I spent some time figuring out, where do I begin? Where do you begin to explain why we are where we are, why we've been here so long, and why it continues to be that no matter how many police-involved killings we witness, no matter how many times we hear the statistics about how many people are locked up, who's locked up, why are they being locked up, this system seems to persist. And I think we have to go back to understand the origins of our current criminal justice system, as well as juvenile justice system, because the origins speak to why the way justice is done in the United States looks the way it looks. And you go back to the United States Constitution, and particularly the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Most Americans who are aware of the United States Constitution and are aware of the amendments to that Constitution will identify the 13th Amendment as the amendment that freed the slaves. And that is the amendment that institutionalized the liberation of Black bodies from slavery across the nation. But you have to actually read the text of the 13th Amendment to come to realize that slavery was not abolished in all of its forms. Slavery was preserved in one particular form. And so you read that amendment and it reads in whole, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So our own United States Constitution preserved slavery and involuntary servitude in one form, and that is within prisons and jails or the criminal justice system. And we're in a nation that has been about discriminating against people of color from its origins. So even after the war, even after the loss of life, even after an amendment that's instituted in the Constitution, there was still part of our system that said, that retained a way to continue to enslave people, retained a way to continue to exercise social control over a particular population of people. The population that's cited in the 13th Amendment is the population who have been punished for a crime. What the system did, however, is make sure that the people who met that definition are overwhelmingly Black and brown across the nation, here in our own state of Maryland, and particularly from Baltimore City. Next slide, please. So I just want to show a couple of examples of how this continues to show up. So the United States has the world's largest prison population. We incarcerate either in prisons or jails or juvenile detention centers or federal prisons. We incarcerate more of our population than any other nation in the world. In fact, we dwarf the prison or incarceration rates of the next nearest nation. So here in the United States of America, we have developed an appetite for locking people up. And we do it more than any other nation, including any other first world nation, second world, third world, democracy, communist nation, any other nation in the world. Next slide. And what you'll also find, again, so out of all of the people who are incarcerated any place in the world, 20% of them are incarcerated in the United States. Just think about that. Think about how big the world is. Think about, we have roughly 300, and I think we're around 360, 380 million. You know, China's well over 1 billion, other parts of the world. But of all the people incarcerated across the entire world, 20%, 1 in 5 of them, are incarcerated in the United States. Next slide, please. So this is where the 13th Amendment and that preservation of slavery or involuntary servitude in some form continues to show up in our justice system today. And I want to speak specifically about Maryland. So in Maryland, 31% of Maryland's general population is African American, but more than 70% of people who are sitting in a Maryland prison are Black. Only 31% of the population across the state, but more than 2/3 of those individuals who are sitting in prison right now. And the rate at which Maryland incarcerates young Black men is higher than any place else in the country. We're number 1 when it comes to locking up young Black men. The next, I think, 2 or 3 states that you will find are all in the deep South. But Maryland incarcerates more Black men, the same men or the descendants of those men who were so-called freed from slavery under the 13th Amendment. The system has held on to them more than 100 years later, continues to hold on to them and to make sure that Black bodies continue to be under the control, both physical control, social control, and even economic control of the state. Next slide, please. And when it comes to our criminal justice system policing, which is what we wanted to focus in part on today, but I think it just in part, police are the tip of the spear when it comes to our justice system and when it comes to our prison population. Because anyone who is ever placed in a jail, anyone who's ever sent to prison, anyone who's ever placed in a detention center, even as a young person, including our youth, they came through police. There was an arrest made first. So police are the entry point. They're the gateway drug. They're the tip of the spear when it comes to our completely out of whack and racialized criminal justice system. This chart that you're looking at is a chart that you can find in the U.S. Department of Justice's report that eventually led to the federal consent decree with the Baltimore City and the police department, showing that the bar is the number of African Americans who were charged with certain offenses, And the blue bar is people of all of the races who were charged with certain offenses. And just for these categories, and these are minor categories, I wanted to do this one on purpose because some people continue to believe that if you're being arrested, if you're coming in contact with the police, if you are ending up in jail and prison, then you must have done something wrong, and you must have done something really wrong. But the truth of the matter is that the overwhelming majority, Black and white and everything else, the overwhelming majority of people who come in contact with the justice system come in contact with the justice system because of something that's nonviolent. Nonviolent misdemeanors are what bring most people into contact with the justice system. And then African Americans are disproportionately coming into contact, being arrested by police, being brought into the justice system for minor offenses, giving a false statement, failure to obey, trespassing, disorderly conduct. These are the things that are getting Black folk, and particularly Black folk in Baltimore City, arrested. Not shooting, not carjacking, not assault. Yes, those arrests are happening, but thousands upon thousands of people from year to year are getting arrested for these minor things, and African Americans are overwhelmingly represented within those arrest categories. Next slide, please. This slide is similar to the last slide, but it talks about the percentage of charges that are dismissed. And I thought it was important to raise this because you may have heard the term catch and release. Excuse me, that was my telephone, my apologies. Catch and release, there was a time under the O'Malley administration where stop and frisk, the policy of stop and frisk was introduced to Baltimore City. And over a period of time, more than 100,000 people were arrested. And the overwhelming majority of them were never prosecuted. They were arrested, they were booked, and then their charges were dismissed. So the system has created practices, policies, and procedures that bring people into the system just long enough to record that they've been brought into the system and then spits them out. And spits them out with an arrest record, spits them out with a court record. And particularly when it comes again to African Americans, Black folk in Baltimore City, we're seeing that there are some offenses that are being used specifically for this catch and release mechanism. Just enough to give an officer somewhere an excuse to arrest a person, only for the charge to be dismissed. But the person has had contact with the justice system, and all of the research, credible research that we have seen has said that that first contact with the justice system, especially if you're young, that first contact with the justice system increases the likelihood that you will have a second and third and fourth contact. Next slide, please. And so we talked about the 13th Amendment in effect, you know, policing being the tip of the spear. I want to begin to shift now into also how that begins to impact young people in Baltimore City. Because since 2014, we do have good news. Juvenile arrests in Baltimore City have fallen by more than half, which is good news. That is great news. But 90% of the youth who continue to be arrested in Baltimore City are African American, whereas the city's Black youth population is only 64%. 90% of young people, 90% of folks under the age of 18 who are being arrested at any given time in Baltimore City are Black. 90%. You go to the juvenile detention center downtown, or you go to any of the committed placement centers all around the state. In some instances, 100% of the population is Black youth. You may see a few white youth, but almost 100%, especially greater than 80% of the Black youth of any of these facilities of youth in any of these facilities are African American, with an increasing number of Latinx young people, and also increasing numbers of girls who are being brought into the system. And there are also disparities in school-based arrests. And so these arrests are happening in the street or in the community, but they're also happening within the schools. And as that slide shows you, you can see that African American students make up a certain percentage of the entire school population across the state, but they account for almost 2/3 of all of the school-based arrests that are happening across the state. So even within schools, even within the school walls, where our children should feel safe, and where the priority should be their education, that 13th Amendment is reaching in even into the schools and capturing young people, and particularly young people of color. Next slide, please. I will end my presentation, or at least my part of the presentation, by talking about the adultification of Black youth. The adultification of Black youth simply means it's something called adultification bias. And basically what that means is that adults are more likely to see Black youth as older than they are, more likely to look at a young Black boy or a young Black girl and perceive him or her as being more adult-like, and therefore less culpable than white youth who are the same age, who are engaging in similar behaviors, or who may have been caught up in similar circumstances. There is a particular study that was done where they did this with police, but then they also did it with female graduate students, white female graduate students. And those students were shown photographs alongside descriptions of various crimes, and they were asked to assess the age and the innocence of the young person in the picture. And the young person was Black, white, or Latino, and they were somewhere between the age of 10 and 17. And this study showed that students overestimated the age of the Black youth by an average of 4.5 years. That means they were looking at a 12-year-old and saying that he was 16. Or they were looking at a 10-year-old and they were perceiving him or her to be 14. And they were also, the study also showed that they found them to be more culpable than white or Latinos when asked to sort of gauge their innocence, particularly when the boys were matched with serious crimes. So that's the way bias, and particularly you may have heard more and more the term anti-Blackness. That is the way bias, racial bias, anti-Blackness is showing up across our population. Whether you're talking about police officers or people who are in the justice system, but even when you're talking about people who are not in the justice system, there is this way of looking at people who are Black and seeing people who are less innocent, who are more culpable. And in the case of our young people, looking at our young people and not seeing young people. Looking at a Black child and not seeing a child. I didn't want to take the time during the presentation, but there's a clip, and my understanding is that these slides will be shared with you once this is over. And I encourage you to click on that link and to watch that clip. It's about 4.5 minutes long, that talks about how adultification bias shows up, particularly with our young women, with Black girls under the age of 18, in a school-based context, in a justice-based context. With this particular slide, and I'm coming to a close, I went to Google and I started to pull images, and unfortunately there were a whole lot of them, of officers arresting kids. And in almost every instance, not every, but in almost every instance, it was an image of a white officer arresting a young person who was under the age of 16. There were some images where it was a white officer arresting a child as young as 6 or 5. And I started to just sort of put those images up to create a visual. But as I was looking at the pictures, I got triggered. And I said, I'm not going to do that, because if I'm getting triggered, I don't want to trigger the audience in the same way. But we've seen the videos and we've read the headlines. And again, this goes back, way back to even at that point where we freed Blacks here in the United States, but preserved a way for slavery and anti-Blackness and the social control of Black people to continue to live on. We did it through our justice system. And so what our nation has simply did is morph to make sure to pull in as many Black folks into the justice system as possible. And that begins to explain, it's very layered and very complicated, but that begins to explain why we're in the mess we're in and why it's going to take real transformation to get us out. And with that, I'll yield. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara. Let's go right into Kira's presentation, and then we'll come back and talk about these things. Kira, would you come back online? And
Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem. I'm trying to figure out, okay. It's hard for me to see my slides. Got it. Are you able to put the slides up? There it goes.
Yeah, can you see them?
Yeah. So good afternoon, everyone. And really, Tara, thank you for that very wonderfully put presentation that really lays out some of the issues as it relates to race and the justice system entirely. So my presentation is going to kind of go into a little bit more nuanced area based on what Tara said. I guess many people leave feeling like, okay, well, what can we do? Why is this continuing to happen, even though we're continuously talking about this, right? And so my presentation will really focus on some of the more macro levels or micro level information that really are helping us advance better outcomes and opportunities and make progress in this racial disproportionality that our system continues to perpetuate. So I'll start with what Tara talked about in terms of policing. Policing is by far one of the entryway as to how people come into this system. However, what happens after police bring people to the doors of the justice system are just as important and need to be explored, because the rest of the system is not really transparent to the, to the in that system is never analyzed, it's never criticized, nor is it ever accountable for what it has done to create a lifetime second-class citizenship brand on many Black and brown communities. And so that is what we at the Defender Office have been really, really fixated on dealing with. So I'll start with my first slide. Policing. We know policing is targeted in some areas. Some people get protect and serve, and some people get law and order. I would submit to you this slide alone is really illustrating how people are treated and why. So within this slide, you see some graphs. And what my office has been able to do was take data and collect data of all the stops in Philadelphia, in particular, the motor vehicle stops. And we have to understand who was stopped, reason why they were stopped, and the results of that stop, meaning, was there anything that they found on them that would actually move towards the fact that these police officers engaged in a reasonable practice because they really believed this person was either engaged in criminal activity or they had a weapon of some sort that would endanger the safety of the officer or others right immediately around. That is the standard. But I don't think many people know that or even care, because what happens is police just willy-nilly stop and search people based on, this is the basic premise, I wonder what he's up to. If that is the question, that is an illegal stop. And it's time for the courts, it's time for lawyers to continue to push to make sure that police are out there doing the duties that they are charged to doing and not overly harassing and overly perpetuating their will on Black and brown people. So as you see in this graph, we tracked all the motor vehicle codes from October 2008 to September 2019. And with that, we found how many people were stopped for what. And you see lights issues. So you got a tail light out, you got a flickering light, whatever that is, one headlight out. Most of the stops were quoted that they stopped people for lights issues. Now these stops turn into frisks and searches where people are actually, these are not just stops where I stopped you, I told you about your light and you went on about your business. When we get them, because they have been entered into a database, is because the officer not just stopped the vehicle, but they searched the vehicle and they frisked the person. And as you can see, the disproportionality by when that happens between blacks, whites, Latinos, and other, and I don't know necessarily what comprises of the other because those nationalities and ethnicities are never really recorded other than other. But, you know, these are the areas where we are really concerned about. And as you can see, 73% of the stops for lights issues and searches of cars and frisks of people were for black drivers. And so when you hear people marching and saying defund the police, we're trying to figure out and scratch our heads, well, what does this mean? Does this mean that police won't be available when we really need them? I think a lot of things have been carved out, and what we have seen that this has meant, because we've added to this conversation, is that we want police to stop doing this. We want police to stop using their resources to engage in unlawful activity that impacts black and brown people the most. And when we get people that come into our system based on this interaction with the cop that sometimes happen as a result of hypertensive conversation, lack of de-escalation, cops pulling people out physically and dragging them out of their cars, and people feeling violated because of that and responding accordingly, we know that this is a problem and this needs to be looked at, and there needs to be a curtailment on this type of police activity. So we have proposed to our city council to really revise and revamp the motor vehicle code to see what police officers can stop people physically for, or what they can just issue a ticket without having the ability to stop and frisk or search a car without some clear and convincing evidence that they do see something that would warrant the immediate threat to public safety. So as you can see, all of the stops and reasons why it's illegal tint, 83%, 81% black, stop sign, 64% black. These are hugely disproportional. And you can't tell me that that only black people, you know, maybe roll through a stop sign or these or such. These are pretexts that we know are used for the reason to pull black drivers over and search their vehicles. Next slide, please. Now I'm gonna, it's a little, can we scroll up a little bit so I can see the entire slide? I'm sorry. Oh, unless if this is it, that's fine. So this is the recovery of what we see in terms of the stops. And when I told you that we know who stopped, reasons why, and what was found, right? So look at the recovery of what they find on people when they say they had to search and frisk the person because they believe that this person had either illegal, contraband on them, which is usually drugs, or a weapon, right? Those are the two reasons why you can stop and frisk. Out of the 73% of the stops for blacks, the blue column represents what is found on them, what's recovered. 12% of the time, a little over 12% of the time, do they find something that is actually recoverable, that's either contraband or some other kind of weapon. Doesn't necessarily have to be a gun, it can be anything. But the other interesting area, and I believe, and I can't see the full graph right here, so if I'm wrong, please correct me. But the kind of greenish graph shows what is recovered when white drivers are stopped. Now, if you compare the previous slide in terms of how often white drivers are stopped, and in this slide, in terms of how often things are recovered, you can see that the rate of recovery of contraband is far more prevalent when white drivers are stopped. And so the fact that black drivers are stopped at such rates that are ridiculously outweighed by what they've been able to recover, is showing a real problem, and something is wrong with policing strategies if all you're doing is stopping predominantly Black people, but you know your data suggests that these people are not the ones carrying some of these things that you are really looking for to protect us in the name of public safety. And so you see the rate of searches following a motor vehicle stop during this period was 5.4% for Black drivers and 2.3% for white non-Latino drivers. I mean, we get searched more often and you find stuff even less. So I think that we're starting to understand that policing in this way is not a necessity. It is not something that's going to give us the assurance of public safety. It is a selected, targeted approach by which people are hoping to find something to justify the business of the justice system. And yes, I say the business of the justice system, because if you're not finding things that often and you're continuously doing the same thing while we still have violent crime that is not being solved, then what is your purpose for doing that? Is your purpose to keep your job? Is your purpose to protect this entity in the status quo so that the people in it continue to have a job that keeps things churning? That's what my estimation is based on what we've been looking at in the research that we have been dealing with. Because if you're telling me in the narrative of public safety that this is necessary, I'm sorry, I don't feel much safer. And so we have to rethink and redo this and reimagine what we want from our police force and what we want from our justice system practices. You can go to the next slide. So moving into the justice system, right? Once police bring someone to the entry of the front door of the justice system, what do we then do? I know you guys have heard or possibly heard about the efforts to end cash bail. And one moment before you play the video, the efforts to end cash bail. And that is because when people come into this system, they are assigned a number of money, an amount of money that it would take for them to get out. And that amount of money is generally charge-based. So if you're charged with this, I'm going to say you owe this. We're not looking at the individual. We're not understanding that the individual is indigent or has no money. We're not understanding that the individual may have a job, may be the breadwinner of a household, may have people they take care of. It is just a random, at least in Philadelphia, a random analysis of what are you charged with and what is your history. And that is how I make my decision as to whether or not you get bail or you're able to go home. As you know, most of those decisions include a lot of biases that do not play out well for Black and brown people. And we've talked about eradicating racism and racially biased decision-making in the justice system, but we have not been able to scratch the surface. Only until we started to engage in a really deep analysis on that front end. We have asked our system to slow down so that we can make differentiations between people and their behaviors and better options that could serve their communities. Meaning, is this a criminogenic issue or is this a social issue? If it's a social issue, let's find a social response. But we need time to adequately analyze whether or not this person is having a bad day or are they really criminogenic in nature that they need the justice system's processes. What we have found is that by shifting the focus to the front end of the justice system instead of the back end, which is called re-entry, we have coined a term called pre-entry, meaning before you have to go to this system, let's figure out who you are, what you need, and let's get you those resources. Because eventually, if we find those right connections in your community, you may not have to go through this system. So this is what we've been engaged in terms of the justice system's practices, and it is actually the only area that is really shown to reduce disproportionality in bail assignments for Black and brown people. So I'm going to play this quick clip by a professor at the University of Penn who studied our process and practice and then began to give his analysis on what the actual production was. Is it playing?
We did a detailed analysis to try and measure what would be the difference in outcomes between a defendant who didn't have access to a more individualized process to the outcomes for people who did have access to this larger suite of services. We discovered that the program was very effective. Without bail advocates, about 7% of defendants experienced those adverse bail violations. With bail advocates, that number dropped to 2.5%. People's likelihood of being rearrested in the pre-trial period dropped substantially by about 40%.
I thought there was a little bit more, but I'm sorry, maybe there weren't. Can we move to the next slide? All right. Wait, I'm sorry, just the one where it kind of explained this. These are areas where people generally get recycled into this system. Meaning if you are out, you may violate because people don't have an opportunity to navigate their life in the expectations of the system. What was not shown in this clip was it actually reduced racial disparities. Doing this process the way we have actually reduced racial disparities by a good percentage. And I don't have the exact number right now, but I will forward that off because it was part of his discussion. But it shows that when we are intentional about trying to reduce, or I would say eliminate, racially biased decision making for Black and brown people that come to this system, we can make a lot of good decisions that really help to reduce that disparity. But if we're not intentional, if we are okay with what is going on and how this impacts communities of color, we will continue to do the same thing. So I don't want anyone to tell me that nothing can be done about what we're experiencing, because it can. It's not going to happen overnight, and it's going to take intentional leaders to help get it done, but it can be done, and we are working on that every day in our system. All right, we can go to the next slide. Now, this is to piggyback off of what Tara said. And we're talking about why the treatment of Black and brown people, and why are we criminalizing young Black kids? We're like criminalizing childhood. Some of the things that I see the children that in our system come through the front doors for are things that I may have engaged in when I was a young kid. They're not extremely, they're not extreme cases that people may hear about on TV and think like these kids need to be in the justice system. We have started to use the justice system as an automatic response for youthful behaviors that if we really wanted to make sure that those youth had an opportunity to flourish and grow out of these behaviors, we would do more to make sure that the professionals that know how to deal with challenges that youth are going through were the first go-to versus the justice system. And I know you've all heard of the school to prison pipeline, and that's a real thing. When they started putting resource officers in schools, all that had done is gave us an uptick in youth that come into our system for things that you would expect a youth to engage in, especially those who do not have de-escalation skills, especially those who do not have a good confidence in their ability to talk through situations. But that was many of us as children. And many of us as children, if we had an issue in school that wasn't a detriment to the community, we would expect to be treated as youth that could go to a counselor or someone or have some discipline within the school that can adjust those behaviors. This is a glaring graph of what we currently have in our system as it relates to race. As Tara pointed out, we have seen a reduction in youth being arrested. However, there is no reduction in the disparities of Black and brown children that come through this system. Most of our current inventory, and I say inventory not to overshadow people, but I say it as in terms of what we've seen in our database. Most of the people that we represent in our juvenile justice system right now are predominantly Black. And it's in the almost high 80 something percentile or 90s. And you can see Black Latinx makes up 2%, white Latinx. And I really, those two, separating Black Latinx and white Latinx is really unfortunate to me because I really do lump them both together. They are in the minority population. But you can see only 1% is white. And some of the things that we're seeing in here are, possession of marijuana, graffiti, school fights where no one was severely hurt. You can't tell me that, their white counterparts are not engaging in the same behaviors. I don't believe so, because I know my children went to school with young white children who engaged in a lot of behaviors. There was just different options available to them. And this is where we are pushing back on the system and saying, enough. When you're bringing kids in this system for behaviors that I know their white counterparts are doing, we're pushing back and saying, this is not a crime. Let's find a better way to deal with it. It's working in some instances. Some judges are dismissing our motions to dismiss, but we're going to keep filing them, because if we're not fighting on a granular level for each kid and pushing back on this system's norms, then we're always going to accept this way that our system handles our children. And what Tara said is correct. They're often more likely to engage in criminal behavior if they've been in the system. But more so, we've seen another aspect that many people are not talking about, and that is the psychological impact on a kid when they come through a system, get handcuffed, come before a judge, and are now on probation. Right? That psychologically does something to these children, whether they're able to articulate it or not. And we've been able to link some of our children up with therapists to really flesh out what this experience has done to them. The last thing I'll say on this is that there are also colleges that are asking kids, have they ever been adjudicated delinquent? Now, these are words specific to the juvenile justice system, because when kids are placed in the justice system and they get found guilty, it's not called a conviction, at least in Pennsylvania. It's called an adjudication of delinquency. And what people seem to think that takes comfort in is that, oh, you're not a convicted person, you're just adjudicated. It does not matter. That in effect functions the same. And when colleges ask, are you adjudicated delinquent? And this is a recent thing that colleges have put on their college application. What are these kids supposed to say? They're going to answer yes. They're going to answer truthfully. And they are getting denied from colleges. So we need to understand the correlation that the justice system has to the quality of life that has been limited for Black and brown people, especially our children. And we needed to demand better from a system that we spend billions of dollars on, and it has had no accountability on how it's destroyed our communities and our families. This doesn't mean the justice system doesn't need to exist at all, but it means we need to do better, and we need to expose the truths. We need to understand what's happening, and we need to work towards getting better treatment for our youth and our Black and brown folks. I think that's all for this. I want to go into one thing, and you can take down the PowerPoint. I want to go into one thing that Tara said about our youth being looked at as older, more culpable, as well as, in need of more punishment. I did represent Michael White on his case, and that case was one where Michael was actually a victim. And unfortunately, and I couldn't get all this together in time, but as I was going through the newspaper articles before I decided to represent him, I was looking at how he was being described. The words that were used to describe Michael White was aggressive, angry. He got revenge on this individual who unfortunately lost his life, and that he was there as an interjector in a situation that had no business of his. And the decedent, who actually did have a history of violence, who actually did have a criminal record, was really described as a really great guy, and I'm sure he was, but he was described in such a way that negated all of the history that we had seen that would have been used against Michael had he had that very same thing. Now, it'd be interesting to know Michael had never had a criminal conviction. He had never even been arrested before on this case. Michael had never even had a fight before in his entire life. We verified that by family members, residents in his community, as well as teachers at his school. These things were really well known. And so people were able to testify to Mike's character. But the issue remained that no one was able to see this young boy as a victim, as he was attacked and defended himself. And he was never able to give that he was never able to be given that status, even from a progressive district attorney who really wanted to do the right thing, but could not see this young man as a victim. And so we have to make sure that our young boys and girls are seen just like everyone else, They are not more culpable just because of their color or their race. They definitely should be looked at in terms of the human experience that everyone has in this society. And I really do think that it's time for us to really talk about how our kids feel when they feel like they are never able to make the same mistakes of their white counterparts without getting much more harsh treatment that follows them for a good portion of their lives. So I want to thank you so much for listening to me, and I can't wait for the question and answer session to be a little bit more interactive.
Tara, would you join us back on screen, please, and unmute yourself as well?
I'm here.
We don't see your video. Let's see.
Okay, how about now?
Okay. Okay. So let's talk about this whole notion of kids being brought in very early. How early are you seeing children, this is for either one of you, coming into the justice system? And Darius, could you make sure we're all on screen at the same time? Thanks.
So I can just speak to what we see in our office and our office's work and Pennsylvania statutes. They allow kids to be arrested at the early age of 10 years old. Anything under 10, unless it's for a heinous crime, where if a kid 8 years old or 7 or whatever commits a murder, they could be brought into the justice system. However, the mental capacity of a kid at that age should be taken into account. There's obviously something else going on than a mens rea required for criminal exposure. But 10 years old, that's so problematic, and we have accepted that as a norm here in our jurisdiction. I couldn't imagine at 10 years old doing something that would land me in handcuffs.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have the specific stats for Maryland, but I can tell you I think we too have arrests as young as 10 and even younger. And when it comes to the school to prison pipeline that we spoke about before, we know that we have kindergartners who are being suspended or even expelled from school because of behaviors that the teacher or the administration is perceiving as serious enough to literally eject the child from the classroom. The numbers of those suspensions and expulsions have fallen in recent years, and that's good news, but it's still a fact that children as young as that are being suspended and expelled, which the data shows us can become a precursor for contact with the system at some point later. And so, I don't know that we have a quote unquote video of a young person that like we've seen in other parts of the nation, but I would think I would be pretty confident in saying we just haven't caught it on tape yet.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying kindergartners are being are being expelled?
Expelled, not suspended, not put in detention, not sent home for a couple of days. They are being expelled.
And so what's the impact of being young and landing in the justice system? I mean, as you, the younger you are, either one of you, what's the impact, that long-term impact of being able to get a job or go to school, or, I mean, what are you seeing?
So that's a great question, because we started making a correlation between the contact with juvenile justice and those other qualities of life. And so, like I said, what we're seeing now are colleges putting things on applications where kids would have to expose their contact with the justice system, and Black and brown kids are far more likely to be exposed to the justice system, as you saw in my graph, than their non-Black and brown counterparts. We're also seeing that although juvenile, people think that this is a situation where kids' records are sealed and you're not supposed to be able to see it. That's not necessarily true. Kids' adjudication are on a record. You'd have to wait a certain amount of time in Pennsylvania for that record to be expunged. So if you are in the justice system and you've gotten probation for, say, a fight or whatever it is, and say you're 17 years old, but you're on probation for 2 years, you have to wait 5 years after that last day of your probation to get that record expunged. So that time between 19 and 24. You still have that on your record, so employers can still see that. And it's not a conviction, it's an adjudication. But I don't know if that matters when it's an adjudication for, and they say assault, right? It doesn't say, Tommy and Mike fist fought in school. It says assault. So that negative connotation is carried with that young kid. But I think what we saw in some of our cases, in one of the most recent case, where a 13-year-old boy was arrested for playing with, it wasn't even a BB gun, it was like a spitball gun with an orange cap. It was about $2, very feather light thing. 13 years old, he was messing around with he and his friends and shooting the little spitballs at a couple of people in the park. He was arrested for the first time in his life, taken from his mother. His mother did not know where he was. And that boy, we fought for him to get back out of the system. But ever since then, this has now been a year and a half, he has been very withdrawn. He's told his mom he does not think he's going to be able to get into the high school that he wants to. He doesn't like to go outside. His mom has had to seek therapy for him, all because of this one experience. And that experience was one where the officers picked him off the side of the street, put him in handcuffs, brought him to the adult police district. His mother could not see him until 4 a.m. in the morning. He was cold, he had not eaten, and then he was transferred to the juvenile justice system where he spent another 2 days. This is where he was also body searched, so he had to, go through the full cavity search. They had to search his private areas and all of those things. And this is a boy who had never been separated from his mother in his life at that time. And so I think when we're talking about this, we have to think about all of the things that happen to a kid when they are brought in, and we can't just relegate it to the conviction, but the full experience and how that makes them feel.
We have a question here. Do you have any suggestions for how we can get these types of issues in front of our local politicians so that they can be given more visibility during the elections, especially local elections? And is that where change needs to happen?
So I would say that that is definitely one level at which the change needs to happen, because most of the things that we're talking about is grounded in a law or a policy somewhere. There is a policy, there is a rule, there is an ordinance, there is a code where these behaviors are written down, are identified as being criminal or delinquent, which then gives the justice system license to respond. And so this is election year in the state of Maryland. It's, on presidential election level, it's election year all over the place, but here in Maryland, and particularly at the city level, there are local elections happening, which means that your elected official, they may not be out at your front door because of the pandemic, but they're on your phone and they're in your email, and they're having virtual town halls. And these are issues that can be raised during those encounters to force them to speak to them. They may not have a ready answer right away, but they need to go back, do their homework, and come back to an answer. So with an answer. So yes, these are issues that can be raised with local officials, whether you're in the city or whether you're in one of the Maryland counties. And this is also something that we're looking to help address. At Open Society Institute Baltimore, we have co-convened, and some of you may have seen our press statement. We have convened what we're calling the People's Commission to Decriminalize Maryland, where we have set up a body of advocates and activists and people who are being directly impacted by these laws to do a complete review of the Maryland criminal and juvenile code, and identify offenses that are on the books that are not about public safety, that are clearly not about public safety, but are about how someone is showing up, that are about that person's identity, that are about that person's homeless status, that are about the fact that this person has some sort of disability, including a learning disability. And so the person's identity or the person's socioeconomic status is what is bringing them in contact with the system. And so the People's Commission is just going to go through the code, and we're going to make recommendations about which codes, which ordinances need to be eliminated altogether, because they do not produce a public safety. There's no public safety interest in having those things on the books, or which ones need to be revised. And then which system needs to respond if a response is needed. So if someone is engaged in a mental health crisis, you're not calling 911. Or if you do call 911, it's not a police officer who is responding, but that call is being routed to a mental health team that is well-trained in responding to crisis. Because again, all of us have heard or seen the reporting and the anguished cries of parents who said, I called the police because I didn't want him to hurt himself or hurt somebody else. And the young person or the individual end up being killed by the police because they were in the throes of a mental health crisis. And so that's just one strategy that we're using here locally to try to get at some of this. But yes, bringing this to the attention of your local, particularly elected officials, is one route that we all need to go in.
Carmen, can I just say something to that really quickly? So some of the things that we have understood and learned is that these things are, it starts with education. And so I would say if you're just going to go straight to your local official to ask them to understand this stuff, it's not going to be as effective that if you start with what Tara was saying at the grassroots level. You're going to have to take people who understand this system and have the access to information to bring it to people who are not engaged or directly inside of this non-transparent system. And I say non-transparent system because how often can you just Google what happens in the justice system? It's not there and it's not readily available. So I would say it takes a concerted effort to team up with people in leadership inside of these systems and ask them for information that can help you go on what we call a people's campaign around specific issues that you really want to address. Because once the people start understanding it, once it becomes a household discussion, then it's easier to push your local officials to do better in this area. But I think the mistake that I made was thinking I'm going to give all this stuff to our city council and they were going to make the change. No, what I had to do is reevaluate and say, well, maybe I need to start with the activists and their constituents. Teach them and show them the information that I have, give it to them, and let them be the advocates for to push on their local officials, because I was not going to be able to do that alone. But what I did in teaming up with the community was really effective in getting, small bites of progress, but we're still not where we need to be.
Mm-hmm. So baby steps with the community, just educating them to show them how it works from the inside.
Absolutely.
And then bringing their voices to bear on those cases. We have another question. What's your opinion on the war on drugs?
Failed.
We lost. We've lost. We're losing.
Losing. And some of the progenitor of the war on drugs has come forward and is on record as stating what the original intent of the war on drugs was, that it was not about safety, that it was about targeting a particular community of people and bringing them under social control. It was a direct response to the civil rights movement. Even some of the hardest advocates for the war on drugs, these 20, 30 years later that we're going on now, they've all recanted or they've all said the war on drugs was a complete failure. Even if they thought they were pursuing the war on drugs for righteous reasons, they have come to realize that the data just show that the war on drugs did not work. The prison population, I told you that, the United States is number one in terms of its prison population, and the war on drugs is what drove. You can literally see a flip. Prior to 1978, the U.S. prison population looked like this. Then the war on drugs came in hot and heavy, and you saw not only did the numbers of the people who were incarcerated go through the roof, but the racial disparity flipped. Prior to I think the date is 1977, 78, 77, there were more white people incarcerated than Black people. But then when the war on drugs really caught hold, and started moving, that racial disparity flipped and it went the other direction, and it's been going the other direction ever since. And so, and again, all of the science that we have learned, even if you couldn't get down with the justice part, all of the science and the data that we've seen shows that people who are using the criminal justice response is not the response that is helpful. Substance use is a public health issue that requires a public health response, not a criminal justice response. So yes, and so the war on drugs is a complete, not only is it a complete and total failure in terms of public safety, but it is also completely warped, distorted, and racialized even more than it had been before our justice system.
Can I also say, I think we're seeing now with heroin that there is no war. So, you know, the bigotry in that initiative, and we still see people continuing to come into our justice system for addiction issues. When you have said to us in our faces that heroin, which is an addiction issue, is circumstantial and needs a social response. It needs more rehabilitation, not punishment. But you're bringing people who are charged in some states with marijuana, you know, crack cocaine and these other things more associated with Black population and Black people. You're bringing them, you're still branding them with a lifetime brand of a conviction. And so how can we have these two dichotomies going on in our society at the same time and not making a bigger deal about it? When you got New Jersey, where Governor Chris Christie, when he was the governor, gave almost $274 million to treatment, to Narcan, to all of these things that protected those who are on heroin from being criminalized or being, you know, negatively stereotyped because they were sick and they needed help. And I'm not saying that that's not the right response. That is the right response. But that response needs to be given across the board if we're going to treat it that way. In Philadelphia, our mayor was just proposing safe injection sites, meaning heroin users can safely inject heroin, and if there's any problem, they will be brought right back to life and given treatment. And they were not to be arrested. They could do this, they could use this, and they were not to be arrested. All the while, our caseloads are still up to here with people who are charged with possession and addiction, violating probation for these very same things. So I'd say, you know, America, we need to get it right. We can't sit here and be bigoted and say that there's still a war on drugs and people who are addicted need to go to jail. All the while we're saying, present millions of dollars for the treatment and programming for heroin addiction because our loved ones are dying.
And even with opioid addiction, right? That's the new painful reality that many families are fighting right now.
And we know the face of that, right? There's a lot of people who are white that are caught up in that. Yeah. And so they do not want to criminalize that population. And they're going to put more money and resources into that. And we're asking for the same.
And so what's as we, you know, sort of draw to a close, what's the answer? I mean, we don't want a war with the police, right? Many of us have relatives, friends, people that we love and care about on the force, or who work in the criminal justice system. How do we bring the conversations around pre-entry, around the decriminalization of children, around you know, just all of this, you know, education of the community? How do we bring it around to one conversation so that there's not a them versus us? You know.
Yeah.
I would say that there are two ways, well, there's more than two ways, but two ways that I would offer up that you can enter this conversation is one is the racial element, to be, just have your eyes open and be brave enough to look the justice system in the face, see all racial disparities, some of which we've touched on, but there are many, many layers, much more complicated, much broader than even what we've been able to touch on in just 75 minutes. See the racial disparities that occur in the system and simply say that can't be right. Like it cannot be that people of color are more criminogenic. It cannot be that people of color are committing more crimes. It cannot be that people of color are more violent. There's something wrong with the system. And therefore, that's what we need to begin to target. But even if you can't get to race, and I will, push and continue to encourage people, because in this nation, we have to have a reckoning when it comes to race. We have to have a reckoning when it comes to race. And I think that there are more people there now than we have ever had, I think, at any point in our nation's history, even considering the civil rights movement. But if you can't quite get to having a conversation, open and transparent conversation about race, just consider the fact that in Baltimore City, the police department is 25% of the entire city budget. That means 1 out of every 4 tax dollars is being spent on police, which means the rest of the city, the rest of your dollars are being split between trash, recycling, health, education, to the extent that we fund education, the recs, parks, lighting, everything, all the other functions that we believe the city should do and that the city is attempting to do. They're having to split all of that up between 3 of your tax dollars, because one whole tax dollar went to the Baltimore City Police Department, $500,000 for the Baltimore City Police Department. That raises the question of what is all of that money for? And it leads us to come to understand that we have asked and we continue to ask police to do more than what they should do. We're asking the police to be too many things to too many people. Other systems have either abdicated their responsibility or have had this responsibility for these certain things taken from them and placed in the police. And defund the police can take on the meaning of right-sizing the police. For us to stop asking and expecting the police to do things that the health system should be doing, that the mental health system, the behavioral health system should be doing, that education should be doing, that youth programs should be doing, and stop asking the police to do those things, and start reallocating resources away from the police and put those resources in the community and where needed in these other systems that have a non-punitive, non-carceral response to behaviors that are not a public safety interest. That would be one place to start.
And Carmen, I would say to your question of how do we kind of engage them, one of the things that we had to do is find our commonalities, right? What is our commonalities of goals? In the justice system, we don't want the wrong person in this system. So if they are more concerned about making sure that there's a public safety, you don't want to arrest the wrong person. You don't want to do things that actually make people more desperate. So what we have done in our space is we found areas where we can avoid wrongful arrests, wrongful convictions. And that was more in our major crimes. And we were saying to police, let's get it right on the front end. Let's get it right the first time. Because when you arrest someone and take everything away from them, the real person's still out there to, villainize the neighborhoods. And so that was the way that we started to begin to really talk about more careful decision making and not just kind of beating confessions into people or, the Central Park 5 situation that we saw. And we were able to have a real conversation from different vantage points, but with the same goal. And saying, I know you want to do what's right, and we want you to do what's right as well. So when you bring people in here after a false confession, after maybe falsifying reports, because that's what happens in some circumstances, and we saw the Central Park 5, that's what happened. Is that really what you want your organization to be known for? And is that helping public safety? And so, while that was a gateway into looking at certain things, we still got a long way to go to really agreeing on what practices can get us closer to true justice, and not use some of these abuse tactics that police officers could have at their disposal and do use.
Well, I am really grateful for you all taking the time to talk to us about this important issue. We could stay on this all day and probably just barely scratch the surface, but if you would stand by as we say goodbye to our guests. Let me just look one more time. There Um, just wanted to make sure we covered all the. Someone asked, how often are prosecutors punished for putting an innocent person in jail?
Almost never. Almost never.
Yeah.
But we just had a great verdict not too long ago, a couple of days ago, $6.5 million verdict for a wrongful conviction. So I
Wow.
thought that was a great way to say his life matters.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, thank you both very much. We're going to continue this conversation. Hope to have you back again. And so thank you, everyone. I want to thank my teammates, Darius Johnson and Anjaniki Jones for working with us in the background, and thank all of our listeners and viewers. We appreciate you. Please be safe out there as we still wrestle with COVID-19 and how do we reopen safely. I don't know what phase we're in, but be safe out there. Thank you very much. And
Thanks so much for having me, Carmen.
all righty.
Thank you.
Same place. Okay.
Kara.
Presenters, can you stay on for just a moment for a photo, please?
Oh, sure. A photo. Oh, no.
Okay. Let me see if I can figure this out. Okay, everybody smile, please. You might need to hold the smile for a second. Okay. All right. You can relax for 2 seconds. Let me see if this worked.
This is
Yes,
Heather. This is Heather Iliff, CEO.
Hi, Heather. I can't see her.
Yes, that's my chief job, is taking photos at the end of webinars. You did a phenomenal job. You both, all three of you were terrific, but my